All right, guys, welcome back. We are here for our next episode. Terry and I are talking about differentiated instruction today. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about and excited about. Terry and I have great conversations about adaptive physical education and how to change things. So I've been looking forward to this one for a while. I'll let Terry introduce herself in a second, but my first things first, the one thing I like to go over is making sure that these PDs after the fact are viewed in conjunction with some knowledge about resources and information that's out there. First one I want to make sure everyone's aware of is going to the DESE website. There's a lot of great resources on there that we get emails about all the time that want to make sure that you guys know there's tons of information on there for your use. Number two, if you are not already involved with MoShape, you definitely should be. It's a great organization that both Terry and I are a part of, and lots of great networking and resources, and just a great group of guys and girls to be a part of. And there's a lot of great stuff coming out of there that you are definitely missing out if you're not a part of that. Third, last but not least, is making sure you're checking in with Shape America. A lot of great national resources coming out there at the higher level. I know on some of our meetings, we have Sean Nevels with us, who used to be at DESE and still involved with MoShape, but now is with Shape America. And so I always like making sure that we're throwing out Shape America, lots of great resources on there also. In addition to the PDs that we're coming out with, which I think a lot of these are viewed after the fact, which is great. I'm hoping that in addition to these, after the fact, you guys are checking out those websites and making sure that you are in the know of all of our resources and tools and networking that's available to us. Okay, I will introduce Terry, who is with us again, and she's going to be talking about differentiated instruction, and I have conned her into letting me chirp in from time to time on this one because I get pretty passionate about this one. So she's been nice enough to let me chime in from time to time. So Terry, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Zach. Great to be here. And Zach did not have to con me into it. I asked him to give his input, so we'll settle that right now. So anytime, Zach, you feel like coming on board and giving your opinion, I would love to have it. Um, a little bit about me. I've taught for a really, really long time, 39 years, going on 40. I am your Central District President, and right now I'm an adapted specialist at the Missouri Schools for Severely Disabled. And you see in this next picture, I'm a bit of if you've seen any of our sessions before, you've heard I'm a bit of an outdoor adventure junkie. I love to kayak and fly fish and hike and do all those fun things. So that's what I do when I'm not making webinars with Zach, or I'm not teaching and I'm not starting track meets. That's another love of mine. I like to shoot the gun at track meets. So a little bit about my teaching. I've been fortunate to be able to teach all different levels, elementary through college, and I really value that because it just seemed like when I transitioned to a different grade level, I was really ready for that, and I learned so much from teaching at those different levels. So I hope that makes you feel like you can identify with what we're talking about because we're going to address different grade levels as we go. Um, let's see what else. I guess the last sentence is what's most important to me in my career now, and that is that I really believe strongly in physical education and health for all students, and I work in everything that I do to create an inclusive environment. And also I'm an advocate for you. So, love teachers. So here we go. These are the objectives for today. Explore strategies for successful engagement of all students. We want to learn and talk about modifications to skills, lessons, activities, and just general inclusive classroom strategies. And this last one, I'm going to give you some resources on this, and we're going to talk about some specific disabilities, but maybe some of the needs associated with a variety of disabilities and how that may affect the student's physical education participation. So, with any presentation, when you look at today's presentation by Zach and myself, just remember You're the expert. You know your students, you know your facilities, and you have to use your filter to really look at what we talk about when it comes to strategies and adaptations. You might think, yep, I totally agree with what Zach and Terry said. I'm good to go. Maybe it's a little bit different for you, the what and the why. And in very rare cases, but once in a while, you might say, you know what, Zach, Terry, that's just not going to work for me in my situation. But always know that you can contact us after you've viewed this session. Feel free to contact Zach or myself, and we can talk through some things. So I like to start with this. This is important to me because we all have goals for all of our physical education students. These are the things that we want for everyone. We want everyone engaged, and we want MVPA, moderate to vigorous physical activity, 50% of our time. That's ideal. That's what we're looking for. We want all students provided opportunities to participate and practice the skills. I don't want to walk into your gym and see someone over here keeping score because we don't think they can participate. That's a pet peeve of mine. So I want them engaged, active, working at whatever level they can. And of course, we always want our students to enjoy physical education and physical activity. And we want our students to be motivated to participate in activity outside of the classroom, because that's really what we're all about. We're encouraging lifelong active learners in everything that we do. So these are some basics that are just part of quality physical education. This helps everyone in your class be engaged and to learn better. Make sure your students know and understand the boundaries and the routines. And in physical education, it's really important that as soon as those students come in the door, we have activity from the get-go. We want them moving and active the very minute they come in. That means you have to be organized. You have to be ready for that class, and you have to be prepared to go as soon as those students arrive. I love to greet my students, even at high school. I love to greet them at the door. I love when they come in and I can make eye contact with each and every one of them, and they know what the routine is once they walk in that door. Stop and start signals. We practice them. My students know them. They understand them. They participate in it. So that's really important. What are your signals? Do you use a whistle? Do you have meet me in the middle? What do you do that lets your students know that it's time to start or stop that specific part of the lesson? I is easy. Involvement by all. I want everybody involved to the best of their ability. And this one's important and difficult for me. When I would do professional development in my one of my previous jobs years back, I got to travel and do professional development across the US. They would film us and then critique our presentations. Was I giving concise, direct instructional clues? That's really important because the more concise and direct we are as teachers, the better our students will understand and respond. I like to talk too much, so that was kind of a hard one for me. Uh, Supervision and feedback. Am I creating a lesson where I am able to move around and supervise all the students and really get whether they're learning and engaged in the activity? And then am I giving personalized feedback? Not just is it productive, personalized, meaningful feedback, not just, hey, good job, but I'm giving them something to think about and work towards. Zach, you can jump in anytime here.
The big one for me is the cues. And I can, like you, I can talk with the best of them. And I've gone through classes where, what does that mean? And I have 3 different cues that end up being about the same thing. And I think they're all great cues, and I can never decide which one I want to go with. And so it's about being concise with those cues is very important, because they may all be great cues, but stick with one and pick one just to make sure the students get it, right on target is what we want.
Absolutely. So I have a hard time going back and forth between inclusive and differentiated instruction and inclusive instruction. And really, they have everything to do with each other, because that's what it is. Differentiated instruction means that you are including every single student. So these are some basic strategies for creating that inclusive environment. Always use student first language, especially when you're working with students with disabilities. I don't have an autistic student. I have a student with autism. I don't have a wheelchair bound student. I have a student that uses a wheelchair. You always put that student first, and that's really important. It's a small shift that makes a huge impact. And getting to know your students. If you don't know your students, you cannot differentiate instruction. You have to take the time and the energy it takes to really get to know your students. And we'll talk more about that later in this session. When you're working with students that have a specific disability, you want to see the possibility, not focus on the disability. I tell my teachers that I work with all the time. Learn everything you can about that specific disability or that situation that student is dealing with. And then I want you to let it go. And I want you to just focus on the possibility, not the disability. Engage students when appropriate in the adaptations. So if you have a student that's struggling with a skill for one reason or another, have them be involved in those adaptations. They sometimes know better than anyone else how they might be able to achieve it. Adapt rules and instructions. We're going to talk about all kinds of adaptations and modifications, but look at the rules, look at how you teach it, look at the activities. You can modify the activity. And most importantly, I think you need to talk to and teach your students about what inclusion means, because they're going to have to buy into it. They're going to be a part of it. And you want them to understand and practice what it means to have an inclusive environment.
I know that these are not in the order of priority, because we put together these lists. Getting to know your students is such an important aspect of just education in general, even beyond this presentation, that one of the best quotes you'll ever hear about education is, students will forget what you taught them, but they will not forget how you made them feel. And getting to know your students and understanding their needs and understanding how to best reach them and best teach them is so much more valuable than just the content that we're teaching them. And adapting a certain activity, those things are great, but students will care so much more about seeing the passion and the love you have for what you do and really reaching your students, more so than how you taught them how to throw a ball or toss a, juggle scarves, whatever it might be. There's so many things that are important on that list, but if you could hone in on one, getting to know your students and getting that level of care and passion for each individual student is just such a crucial thing.
Absolutely. That relationship is key. And I always start the term, whether it's a semester or a year-long class, I used to always start, and there was one student that didn't really respond to me well or didn't interact very well. And I'm like, that's my challenge this term. I'm going to make sure that that student understands that we care about him or her and that they have a place in this class. So, yeah, That's for sure. Thanks, Zach. So I love this visual, and this is from ASCD, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, which has some great resources. But I just like the visual. Differentiation is, and I'm going to let you look at that. It's been up for a while, but I love all these different ideas and how they put it into a visual. And you know what? That those visuals are important to use with your students too. I like to see them, students like to see them. It's another way to teach. And I'll show you later in the session. I use visual schedules with some of my students. And that's a really fun way to teach. So we're talking about what differentiated instruction is. And I'm going to let you look at this, but differentiated instruction provides each student with different methods of learning since each student learns, processes, engages, expresses in their own way. And this involves teachers adapting to meet the needs of every student. Boy, that's a tall order, isn't it? It also means considering the many ways students will differ, including for us in physical education, their ability to move, how well they see or hear, how they process information about the world around them, their interests, their cultures, their motivation, and so many other things. But that's what I think of when I think of differentiating instruction. And there's a lot of benefits. So understanding your students' individual differences, this goes back to really getting to know your students. That's going to help you design lessons where all students can learn effectively. And you know what? It's going to make us more creative as teachers. You're going to have to sometimes think outside the box when you're trying to address different learners. Don't you think, Zach? I mean, that's
Yeah,
I see you smiling.
yeah, it's, there are a lot of challenges with it. And as teachers, the one thing that I always remember is as teachers, we always want to be able to reach 100% of our students at all times. And it's a hard thing to juggle. It's hard to be the best possible teacher for every single student that we have. And it's one of those goals where you spend your entire career just aiming to get there. And it's as
Absolutely.
long as you never stop and you keep trying, some of us may never get to be 100% of the teacher that we want to be for every single individual student that we have. But as long as you are spending each day trying your best to be that, I think that the results will be there. And I also think that the students notice. They see that you're trying, you're doing your best. And so,
Absolutely. So it may be challenging at first, but the more you practice modifying and adapting, and one thing that's really important about those adaptations and those modifications is you documenting them, because I don't know how many times I've gone back to notes or documentation of adaptations and I think, "Oh my goodness, that worked in this situation, that might also work in this scenario." So, it's really important to jot those down or to keep those in a file, however you document, and so that you have those as a resource. It becomes natural once you practice it, and I just put you know, when you're teaching a unit, it's sometimes so difficult because there's some students that are ready to really move forward and get into gameplay and activity. And then there's some that really need that time to work on those skills. And we're going to talk about some of the grouping strategies later on and how best to deal with that. So, one of the cool things about physical education, and Zach and I talked about this earlier, we have a lot of ways that we can adapt. There's all kinds of ways that we can make modifications. And I truly believe that we as physical educators probably differentiate better than most of the people in the school building because we have so many kids coming to us with all different kinds of skill levels, and we're trying to achieve a certain skill, and we have to figure out how to get each person to the next level. So I think we're good at this, and we're going to talk about some ways that we do that. So we can modify the content, the process, the environment, the lesson, the assessment, and some of the things we might look at are listed here. There's all kinds of equipment resources that can completely change an activity and a student's ability to perform that activity. We can change the boundaries in the activity area, or we might not have boundaries. Same with time. We might speed it up, we might slow it down, or we might take out the time element altogether. We can change the rules, the prompts, and we talked about earlier the cues. We might need to change the cues for certain students. And then when it comes down to it, we can change the actual action. So, I mean, there's so much that we can do as physical education teachers. And then within that modification, there's things that we can do. I mean, this can get very granular. So, equipment modifications, for example, I might look at the limitations. What is the specific situation that I'm dealing with? Does a student have limited accuracy or coordination or strength or vision or balance? And I can modify the equipment based on that limitation. Or maybe I just do it by the equipment. I modify the ball, the bat, the racket, the target, the goal, or by the characteristic. And I do this a lot: the size, the sound, the speed. An example of speed would be if I'm using a regular ball in volleyball, but I have someone that has delayed reaction, maybe I need to move to a finger light or a beach ball or to a balloon. Make sure you use latex free. But all those items are just one simple way to change by the characteristic of that piece of equipment. We could go on and on about this, couldn't we, Zach, forever?
There are so many ways to modify, and the really exciting part about it, especially for physical education, is we all love to be creative. And adapting your lessons will only go as far as your creativity allows you to go. And there are times where I've put an issue that I needed to face and an activity, and how many different ways can I adapt this? How many different ways, and nothing trains you for that better than being in PE, because we are one of the few subjects that routinely loses our classroom. We'll lose certain things where, oh, we need the gym today. You're going to be in the library today, or you're going to be in the hallway between these two, and it's how do we adapt this real quick on the fly for our new environment or for this new scenario. And it's, I would think that out of all the curricular subjects, we are the experts of adaptation because we have to do it even in our daily routines. And so it's, we get creative with it. It's the only way that it's going to be as successful as we want it to be.
Absolutely. So I throw this slide in just because it gives you a visual of some of the modifications that I use regularly in my physical education classes. So I might use success balls, and those are easier to catch. You can grasp them. Even if someone just has a finger pinch, they're able to catch or to drop or to toss that type of ball. One of my favorites is the yucky ball. That's a weighted ball, and it takes different shapes, takes on different shapes. I love the name of it too. I mean, who doesn't love a yucky ball? That's awesome. But some of our students might need that sensory diet, that input. So I have weighted balls, or I have string balls or yarn balls, or the one on the lower left, that's a real soft, big, fluffy ball. It's attractive to your eye, and it feels good. So once again, that sensory. The big red bat I use a lot because it's oversized and it's bright. I do a lot with colors because my students like to coordinate colors. So you can tell all of these examples are examples of bright color coordinated equipment. And that's just kind of my thing. The lower left, those are called finger lights. And I jokingly said latex free. But for a long time, I pushed for companies to make latex free items for our kids because I've always had students that have latex allergies. And those are called finger lights, and those are latex free. So I'm just letting you know those are a game saver for me. Anything on there that you like, Zach? Any of those pictures?
All of it. It's I, I've always been split 50-50 on the color versus no color. And I think you touched on it, where I've had students with sensory conditions where it could either be an emotional thing where they have to have a certain color, or the color is too much and it doesn't allow them to focus on the task, and keeping it white or gray, or a very contrast neutral color helps. And so having, I would say, a selection is a really good way of going about it, because again, adaptation can happen in our class, but it's a year to year and school to school, and there's always going to be something new that we need to adapt to. And so having the selection of equipment, which if you're fortunate enough to have this kind of selection, that's awesome. But there are a lot of schools that we have to make with what we got, and there's certain things
Absolutely.
that, and so it's finding out what situation will work best for you. That's a possibility, and using that as your adaptation. And then in the future, hopefully, we can build up to getting more access to more creative equipment that can better reach a larger spectrum of our students. But doing the best of what we got and adapting to the best of our ability for our situation.
Absolutely. Been there. And that's a great point about the color, Zach. I love that. Um, I've wadded up paper balls and made paper balls before as sensory items. So you can be creative with what you have. Absolutely. And I am fortunate, but part of that's because I've taught so long, I have so much equipment, right?
Do you
That's
have
the
that? Do you have
advantage.
access to all the equipment on this page?
I do.
You're living in luxury.
Part of it is when I did professional development, the vendors would give me equipment and then I got to use it with my kids. So,
Awesome.
yeah, that was a definite plus. I know, I'm spoiled. I'm spoiled. Think to yourself, I always put this in here because I always forget to ask this question if you have questions. So if you have questions about equipment modifications, or you just want to chat through something with Zach or I, please don't hesitate to let us know and contact us. We're going to give you our contact information at the end of this session, and we just want to keep saying that. So hopefully you'll hear me say that again, but we want to remind you to contact us. That's why we're here, is to help you with anything that we can.
I told Terry earlier that in addition to adding questions, I have such an open door policy that my office doesn't even have a door. And so it's, I like hearing
I
from
love
anybody about
that.
anything at all times. I don't even have a door. So please contact me. It's my pleasure to talk about stuff.
That's awesome. Okay, so these are some things that I think about when I'm doing lesson planning. This just kind of breaks it down. When I think of my students in that particular class, and Zach said we adapt year to year, week to week, and we adapt sometimes hour to hour or class to class, because you might have one class with some real specific needs that's very different from the class that you have the next hour. I've been there, done that. So sometimes you have to think through the whole day, 1 hour at a time. So I think of my students and I think of what the lesson is for that day, and I'm asking myself, everything goes through this lens. Who might this activity exclude? Who's going to struggle? Who's going to have some issues with this activity? That's the first thing. And then when I look at my lesson, I know and understand the central purpose of my lesson. I know and understand the activities that need to be performed. How am I going to group my students to best carry out the specific activity, what instructions or prompts will I use. I'm kind of crazy about planning things out, but I'm gonna know that ahead of time. And then I'm also, before I go into that classroom, I'm already gonna ask myself, what modifications can be made so everyone in that class will be able to participate? And it doesn't take a ton of time, you guys. You get in a routine of just, this is a normal process that you
Mm-hmm.
go through as you prepare. Um, I'm going to choose skills to be acquired and what level are they to be achieved. These are things I think about. What skills are going to be acquired and what level? What students need particular support with skill acquisition? And then evaluate and determine how best you can give that support. Are you going to use a peer tutor? Is it going to be you as the teacher? Are you going to use a paraprofessional or an aide that will help if you have access to those? Sometimes I did, sometimes I did not. Or am I going to have a small group situation where a group of students are working together to try to achieve those skills? There's lots of different options, but these are all in the planning stage. This is all items that you think about before you ever go into that classroom to teach that lesson. And then a couple of things here. I really like to use peer and self evaluation. I definitely use them throughout the term, whether it's a semester or a year long class. And I always have skill cues and checklists for my students. So if they're evaluating themselves, they may have a skill cue list or a checklist that they're looking at. If they're evaluating a peer, they use that checklist and that skill cue list. Now, this is important because when you allow students to self evaluate, it doesn't mean that I don't ever evaluate. Of course, I do. But when I allow my students, it engages my students, it empowers them, and it get totally gives them buy-in to what we're doing. They like to have that student-led opportunity. And then I have the students reflect. How did I score on this skill assessment? What skills do I still need to work on? How can I improve my score? So it's individualized. It's not everybody's at the same level trying to get to the same level. It's individualized and you're trying to improve where you are right now. So I'm taking that student where they are and I'm helping them go to the next level. And we talked about grouping. Sometimes I group similar ability and sometimes mixed ability depending on what I'm teaching. But I like this idea of recreational or competitive, and I let the student choose. Do you want to be in a recreational game setting, or would you like to be in a more competitive setting based on how you are doing on your skills? Do you ever use that, Zach?
Yeah, I love the different group placement. I've done a variation of that also where, and it goes into more of a student choice individually, where I may set up 6 or 7 stations that are all focusing on the same movement, same skill set, but at varying levels. And the students can decide, hey, try and pick 1 out of the 7 or 2 out of the 7, or see how many you can get through and it repeats the same, for instance, basketball, where the highest level may be shooting a 3-point shot and the lowest level might be an implement where we're using a beach ball and a trash can, or different implements, and we're repeating the same motions, but we're creating different levels. And I don't word it to my students as this is low level, this is high level. It's just varying activities that are all mimicking that same movement, but just using different implements. And I'm, make it a fun game where you're going to barely throw this balloon and it's going to float, and see if you can get it in there, or see if you can drop it, and creating these different ideas. One thing I will add on to one of the last slides that I think is really important is collecting data about what we do, and collecting data about if you make adaptations for a lesson or a unit, keep that. You have to keep it, because that situation will come again. It will happen again, and it's only going to make you a better teacher having that later on. What did I do that one year when I had something like this? I don't remember what I did. And using data to improve our instruction and adding on to, so we're not starting from square one. We have that information already. And then the other thing I really like to do, that this takes some time to start building up your repertoire, so to speak, where when I adapt, I start developing alternate rubrics, where as I adapt, I'll develop additional rubrics where, hey, if I need to adapt to this, and I might put a list of some different implements or different activities, this is the rubric that I'm going to go with. And it's still going to be the exact same scoring as any other of the different activities, but I can adapt my rubric to best fit that student's individual success in what we're doing. And so I really value that, where that's the one thing that I have with standardized testing, where students are not standardized. And so it's really hard to hold all my students to the same standard. We're all individuals. We all have different ability levels in any given subject in school or life, whatever it might be. And so I really like adjusting my rubrics and developing new rubrics to what is going to show me that you have succeeded to the best of your individual ability in any given activity. And it's tough to make one rubric, and that's why I said keep your stuff. If we make these new rubrics and these new adapted activities, hold on to that, because it just makes that unit for you that much more concrete and thorough of a unit.
Absolutely. And at the very beginning, we said document, document, document. Keep documentation of what you do and why and the specific situation. And those you end up having a wealth of resources just from your own work. So that's absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so now this is a really fun little exercise. And what we want you to do, I'm going to I'm going to give you a challenge, and I want you, as you're watching this, to reflect on strategies to adapt. And then we're going to take that challenge a step further. I would like for you to share that with one of your colleagues when you have the opportunity. Maybe it's a professional community meeting, professional community group, or it's your physical education department meeting. But share those ideas with someone. Say, hey, I saw this awesome webinar with Zach and Terry, and this was one of the challenges, and this is what I came up with. What do you think? Okay. And Zach and I can talk about these too, what we would do. But we want you to do this. It's important to practice, because what we said earlier, the more you do this and you come up with these modifications, the easier it gets. So, this is the first scenario. You have a student who has limited strength and mobility in his or her upper body in a class of 40. Today, you're assessing basketball skills. So, what could you do to ensure that the student is successful? What might you think about beforehand that would create a successful situation for that student? I think Zach just told us one of one of the things that I would do. I would have modified equipment and maybe even stations, and the students would go through all of those stations. So they might have a shorter goal, so that they didn't have to, if they have limited strength and mobility in the upper body, that they don't have to shoot the ball as high for those skills. I could have a smaller basketball or a lighter basketball. Zach, what do you think of?
Yeah, I would go back to changing equipment, and have, one thing that I'm always particular about is I never want my adaptation to single out a student, to make my class come to a point where we're doing this because of this situation. I always fold it into where I would do it with any other class regardless. And
Right.
The equipment change is a fun one. For this example for basketball, one thing I would think of is finding as many different implements for a ball and as many different implements for the goal as you can find. And there are a lot of fun ways to change that. For instance, if you've seen those little there may be 4 feet tall, or the little Tykes plastic hoops, where and those are really cheap to find. You can find people that'll give them to you, and getting 2 of those, and then having a bin with different balls. And then if you have students maybe charting their progress, what ball did you use and how was your success with that implement? And they're allowed to choose that implement. And so if they would like to use a beach ball that can float a little easier, it might be easier to throw for someone who lacks strength and some mobility. That'll be an easier implement for them to use, or maybe gator balls. Those are a little easier. Or if you wanted to try and use an actual miniature basketball or a tennis ball or a baseball, different sizes of implements can help some change that also. And so I like your idea for the stations, thinking of different equipment that you could set across the gym where it's adaptable by nature, not for any specific situation, but the students have the ability to adapt it to their need. If they want to be, like you were saying, competitive versus recreational, they want to have fun and try with a tennis ball. Or we could also give a sheet where, hey, we think this may be the hardest one to use. This one may be middle ground, but everyone should start with this. This is where everyone should be starting, regardless if you're a varsity player or whatever your ability might be. Let's start with this just so you can see what the motion is going to be like, and then they can work up. And that way, if students want to work up to a more difficult task or maybe the full size goal, they can do that. If a student would rather stay at the lower goal and work on maybe challenging themselves with a different ball, that's we're challenging both in their own respective ways, and we're going to see great results from that. And so I would say that the equipment modifications and then the student-driven challenge, I really like that aspect because it lets them push themselves as far as they individually would like to go. And that's where I think it increases that enjoyment level and it increases that satisfaction of success. And at the end of the day, we can teach a lot, but success in each individual adaptation is really what we're going for. And I think that's a great way to get that done.
Absolutely. So when you were talking about that, it made me think of one of the adaptations we did one year with basketball. We took hula hoops and we had bleachers and we pushed them in, and we put the hula hoops in between. We stuck those into the bleachers, and it was great because the students were able to, and we did a fun time challenge. So they would shoot and then move on to the next one, and we had them all the way around the gym. It was awesome. So we had these hula hoops suspended as giant goals. It made for a very successful, fun classroom. And
I love that.
I love how you say that it shouldn't be, you want to create the modifications and sometimes the choice of those modifications for all students to make an inclusive environment. You don't want to single out your students and say everybody else is going to use this, but you're going to use this ball. That would be the wrong way to make that student feel included.
Yeah.
But I love how you brought that up. Great job. Okay, scenario number 2. You have a student diagnosed with emotional disturbance, ED. He or she is prone to outbursts in a class of 35. You are assessing football skills outside with partners.
That's a fun one.
It is a fun one because, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll go first with what not to do. And I won't say any names, but my very first year student teaching was at an elementary school, and there was a student in there with severe, emotional tendencies. And I watched my mentor teacher put him into the equipment room and close the door. And it was something that was agreed upon with parents and whatnot, where he's not safe for himself and anybody else. And so we're just going to let him cool off in there. And as a student teacher, I was deer in the headlights, wide-eyed of, did you just lock a student in a closet? So I would not recommend that be your course of action. I think that
that would be inappropriate.
I would. That's why I started with that one. Don't do that. to try and, off the top of my head, answer the question, I would think that this goes back to knowing your students and, knowing if they have triggers, if they have certain environments that are too high on their anxiety level, they're too, there's too much sensory, coming in that they can't handle, and monitoring that. I always like to, I know what students have their buddies in class and which ones have their friends in class. And sometimes you want to avoid having your students be with their buddies because it can tend to lead to some distractions. But there are certain situations where it is of a benefit. And our number one goal is to make our students feel safe and to make them feel comfortable in their environment, and that allows us to encourage that success no matter what we're doing, because we are encouraging the fact that no matter what we're doing, we want to make all our students feel comfortable in that situation. And so I would think that in this situation, if they're with partners, having that student be with someone who they're very comfortable with, and someone that they don't feel intimidated by or anxious around, will help alleviate any concerns that we may have of there being an incident. There is never a situation where I say that it is eliminated, that situation's eliminated. That doesn't happen in education. We always have things that come and go. And so best we can do is we plan for that ahead of time. That's part of our planning and our lesson plan, where, hey, I know that I have a student that is gonna benefit more from this being in a certain scenario. And if I can mix that in, you're doing yourself a great service by doing that, because it's going to allow you to not only help that student much more, but create an environment where all your students are going to benefit, because there isn't going to be, any situation that may distract from your lesson.
Absolutely. So a couple things that you said just really stuck out for me. You talked about triggers and noticing triggers, and we as educators, we have to, that's part of getting to know your students. You have to look for those triggers, those visible signs that that student may be getting upset or distressed. And then the other thing that I do, I always, if I have a student that has a diagnosis of ED, I always make sure that we have a plan for breaks, or we try to de escalate before something happens. And so I try to, depending on the grade level, if it's younger, you would have to teach them to ask for an appropriate break. If they need some time, a neutral break away from the activity, you would want them to ask for that, and be taught how to do that appropriately. So, being able to take a break, you observing and noticing. And then the other thing that you said, Zach, that's really important is that they have a trusted partner. So if you are partnering, you know that that's a successful partner, or what I call selective partnering on my part when I have a specific situation like that.
Yeah.
So,
The other thing I would add to that, talking about triggers, is, triggering, as individual as that may be, a lot of the responses to that trigger and the de-escalation is just as specific for students as a trigger is, where a de-escalation tactic may work really great for Terry, but it would work terrible for me. And it's really important to understand those things and getting to know your students. And one of the best things I ever did, and this is before I knew as much as I do now about de-escalation and about, adaptation, was I asked my student, hey, when you're having trouble in class, what can I do to help? And it's especially with high school age students, they're aware of their surroundings, they're aware of what can happen, and sometimes simply asking, hey, what do you need from me? What can I do to help you? And sometimes it's as simple as, hey, do you need to take a music break? And I had a student who would put on his headphones and just needed to have some music for 5 or 10 minutes to come back into his space, and then we were okay. Or it's, hey, do you need to take a lap? Sometimes as an athlete, go take a lap is a consequence. And as I found out, like, hey, do you need to take a lap? We go walk and cool your head, and gets back to trusting your students and knowing your students of, he's not going to run away. He's not going to, go take your lap. It's okay. There's no shame in that. And take the bathroom pass, so it looks like you may be using the restroom, so that students aren't seeing what's going on or whatnot. It's just any other student leaving the class with the bathroom pass, and take your lap and come back. And so I just wanted to add that in, as specific as triggering can be. De-escalation is just as specific, and learning what those de-escalations are for each individual student is really important.
mm-hmm. in my classroom now, I have some students that have some pretty severe behaviors. And when I notice that someone is starting to do some things that make me think that they're going to escalate, we might stop the entire class and we all might do some deep breathing exercises, just take a mindful minute
Yep.
and kind of reset. But there's, you as the teacher have to be able to guide that and recognize that and then offer choices that are going to be successful for that individual student.
Yep.
That's awesome. Okay, here we go. You have a student with asthma in a class of 30, and you are doing aerobic capacity fitness testing.
That's a fun one.
No, well, and that's all
Yeah.
about planning and being prepared too. So
Yep.
if you know you're doing that, you have a student that's diagnosed with asthma, of course you're going to, if they have an inhaler, you're going to make sure that that is present and available. You're also going to have a plan if that student feels uncomfortable or they feel like they are um, going to have a situation with their asthma, then you would have a plan for them to communicate that to you. And I mean, I think that one really is all about planning because we
Mm-hmm.
want all of our students to do as much as they can. And a lot of my students with asthma are able to do the same as everyone else, but we have some safeguards.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah, 100%. I would say the inhaler and any type of equipment or anything that they need for any specific movement is really important. The foundation that I always build is building my knowledge of the student, and whether that be through the nurse, through their parents, hopefully both. Having that plan in place, and I always view that as my baseline, but not my end all be all. Where my end all be all is if my student tells me that they're having trouble or they feel uncomfortable, that overrides any other information that I have. I will always err on the side of, oh, well, if you think that you're not feeling great, but your paperwork here says that you can do this, that I would not recommend that is the route that we go. I view their response and their opinion right now of how they're feeling as my gold standard of how I treat them at that specific time. Where if they need a break, perfectly fine. That's the last thing we want is ever to endanger one of our students because of fitness testing. While fitness testing is important for a variety of reasons, it's not that important. Will
Absolutely.
always err on the side of our student safety and our student health overall. And so I would say that building that knowledge of those individual situations, and you can treat asthma and that knowledge the same way that you would treat any adaptation, where as you plan your classes, you know that you're going to have a student that may struggle with this because of any variety of reasons. And so having theoretical adaptations in place that you may need to go to given that circumstance happening is a really easy thing to do to prevent that we get to that situation. Oh no, how can I do this real quick? And that's where that planning comes into effect. And it's spending an extra 5 minutes putting down some notes for planning will help you alleviate a lot of those problems.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Awesome. Okay, we'll do one more. And I don't have the time in front of me, Zach. Sorry. Are we okay?
We have a few minutes. We're okay.
Okay, so this will be our last one. You have a student with autism spectrum disorder working with a group of 4 students in a class of 35. So you're doing small groups here. The task is to create a dance using a rubric that you yourself have made. So you've got a student with autism that's working in a small group creating a dance.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that you would think about preparing for that?
Yeah. So this actually, I'm going to start sounding like a robot about knowing your students. The couple things come to mind because I've had some scenarios similar to this where there are a couple of things that come to mind. Number one is knowing the capabilities of your student. If you have a student with autism, when I hear people say they're on the autism spectrum, that means a variety of things to me because the spectrum seems to be infinitely long of all these variations, and there's so many things that so many things that could be on that could be happening. And so knowing knowing the individual student and understanding, you know, if they have any limitations, what their capabilities are, what if they have anything that bothers them, doesn't, for whatever activity you're doing, is a really important gauge to have, so you understand that starting. The second part of knowing your students is, depending on the situation, surrounding them with students who you know will support them in a way that some students maybe just aren't capable of doing yet. And there are some students who are, I like to view them as, you're ahead of your time. And I have certain students where you could, if I had to run to the restroom real quick, there are students like, you're in charge of class. And I know that I would trust them to, you know, that nothing would go wrong, that we'd be just fine. And so I think that a lot of it is knowing the individual student, but also surrounding them into an environment that not only adapts to their needs, but isn't singling them out. You know, they're going to be a part of a group just like anybody else, but I'm surrounding them with students who will help give them that nurturing feedback and that guidance that I would be giving them, but they're going to help support them. And, you know, it's putting them into an environment that is going to encourage that success on any scale. I mean, this isn't even on an adapted scale. This is just in general. This is, my goal is always to adapt when necessary, but always encourage, we want to close those gaps if they're there. And this is not a, you are different, or this is a disability. It's what is possible. How can we make this as close as we can? And how can we, make that inclusive environment? And so I think that those simple changes will really encourage that success. Or if you have a student that is really good at dancing, it will just take the lead and they'll steal the show and everybody else can stand in the back. That's another way to do it. But that was the group that I was in. I was in the back just standing here like this, and we had the guy doing breakdancing in the front. But
That's awesome. Yeah, I totally agree. So once again, it's kind of that selective grouping this time, not selective partnering, but you're thinking about who will support and encourage that student regardless of what what the skill is. One thing I did think about, some of my students with autism they don't do well with the loud noises. So if the students are using music, you may want to cue some of those students in that group. They may need to bring the volume down a little bit, and be aware of that and be sensitive to everybody in the group. But that's part of that teaching inclusion that we talked about earlier. Your students are aware and trying to be inclusive with one another. So awesome. Very cool. Okay, let's move on. So this is just a fun thing for you to think about as you're viewing this. What is the most common situation that you find yourself needing to adapt for? And then you personally, what's the most challenging situation that you need to adapt for? And Zach mentioned students with autism, or if they say a student is on the autism spectrum, that can mean anything, because I have a daughter who's a behavioral therapist, and she works full time with students with autism. And she always tells me, Mom, if you have one student with autism, you have one student with autism. Every student with autism is different. So I can't give you specifics for students with autism. A lot of it is trial and error. And the reason I bring this up is sometimes that was the most, while I absolutely love those students with autism, I love the challenge. That is sometimes the most challenging group for me personally. The most common for me is just students with delayed skill or lower skill levels. That's what I adapt for most. But sometimes the most challenging is because that student with autism, there's just such a wide range of behaviors and abilities. What about you, Zach? Any comment there?
I get comments on everything. That's a discussion that I've been in multiple times. And I have teachers coming to me about adapted PE, and more specifically about the prevalence of the increase of students with autism, and how it's since whichever year, it has increased and increased and increased. And why is this increasing? What's going on? And if you look at the picture of the autism spectrum as a diagnostic tool in the 80s and 90s versus what it is now, what qualifies on that spectrum is so much more now than what it used to be. So I think a lot of that data is really hard to interpret, because what qualifies as a autistic spectrum diagnosis now maybe wouldn't have in the 90s. And so the gross increase in the number of students or individuals isn't always a analysis of the actual number, more so than what qualifies as a student or an individual with autism now versus what it used to. Because I think if that spectrum had been the same size that whole time, the increase may not have been as drastic as it is. But
Right.
Understanding your situation and your students, it's the best that you can do. And sometimes I would say that having a student with autism is not itself reason to adapt. You have to know the individual, and you have to know the individual situation to know what to adapt, because I have had students who are on the autism spectrum who needed no adaptation whatsoever.
Absolutely.
It's not using a diagnosis as a crutch. And you get to know your student first and foremost. And I have had students with a variety of disabilities who seemed into my classes just fine. And it's all individual to the student. And so it's not, I would encourage teachers to not solely rely on a diagnosis for any given individual circumstance to be your adaptation, but to use that as a guideline and as a reference in getting to know your individual student, and then building your adaptation based on the culmination of those two pieces of information that you get.
And something that you said, this triggered something for me. What I try to do in my classes is to create lessons and activities and opportunities for students to see each other as people. So for my students that do not have any kind of special situation or disability or challenge, I want them to see the students with disabilities as a person. I want them to look past that disability and get to know them as a person, as an individual. So creating that environment, that's again one of those strategies for inclusive environment, is teaching people to look past the disability. Awesome. I mentioned a visual schedule earlier. Some of my students are very visual, and they need to know what's coming next. So I might have a schedule that has the warm up, the specific activity that we're doing, a reward for them when we're finished. I may use sign language in the visual schedule if they sign, but I just wanted to just put that in there so I didn't forget to say about the visual schedule. And then I left this on here for those of you that might want to check out some apps that are for specific categories. So you might be able to use some technology that will help with your lesson. And this is what I want you to think about just for yourself, and you can share with someone that you feel comfortable sharing with in your setting. A strategy that you will use to increase engagement for all students. And I want you to identify an equipment modification that you could use tomorrow. Okay. And we are back to the check our objective. Did we talk about how you could implement strategies to engage all students? Did we explore modifications and planning for equipment, lessons, and activities? And I believe that we did. And I am just so happy to be a part of this today. Thank you so much. And my name again is Terry Garner. This is my school email. So feel free to email me. That's my Twitter handle. So follow me on Twitter. I make it about education and quality practices. So would love to have you follow. And Zach has his contact information too, I believe.
I have it. It's posted, but I sent it out in the email to everybody. So
Okay,
hopefully everybody has it. But if
awesome.
not, it's an excuse to make them go to the DESI website to find me.
There you
I
go.
can shameless plug that. Terry, thank you again as always. I will give one plug. In addition to those apps, I'm pretty sure Terry could start her own app, and it would be probably the best selling app in education there is. So you should
You're
use her
so sweet.
use her email as an app handle and contact, because she is a wealth of knowledge, and I feel very fortunate to have you with me on these talks, because we always have a great time, and I come away learning a lot, which is always, as educators, what we want to do. So
I love sharing these with you. It's fun. I learned something from you, and I love that we can talk about something and it triggers something for the other person to share. So that's
it's
awesome.
a
Thank you.
it's a trigger with no de-escalation needed, which is exactly which is good.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Terry, thank you again. Everybody who is tuning in and watches after the fact, I hope you guys reach out. If you have any questions, please get a hold of us. But we will see you guys next time. Take care.
Thanks. Bye bye.